"Sir, this boy lived with me in the orphanage," Maid's daughter said. Billionaire secretly followed. 12 years of silence. 12 long years of living with the belief that his son was gone forever. Until one day, a child whispered the impossible. "Sir, the boy in the painting, he used to live with me at the orphanage. In a grand suburban estate built from power and sorrow, Jonathan Whitmore, once one of America's most formidable billionaires, now existed as a mere shadow of the man he used to be. Each day, he wandered through gilded halls heavy with memory, haunted by the portrait of his 6-year-old son, the child's smile frozen eternally in a wooden frame above the fireplace. Wealth had become a cold armor around him, but it could not shield his soul from the loss that had eaten away at it for more than a decade. Then, one day, a new housemaid arrived, bringing along her 13-year-old daughter. It was a simple change in staff, nothing more than a routine replacement after the former help retired. The girl was told never to enter the west wing of the mansion, the place where Jonathan kept everything that had belonged to his lost son. But on that day, fate, as it often does, ignored the rules. The girl wandered into the great hall, her gaze lifted to the painting high on the wall. And then, with a voice that trembled, soft and unsure, she spoke words that struck like a hammer against the heart he had buried beneath grief. "I know this boy. His name wasn't Whitmore. At the orphanage we called him Caleb, but he once said his real name started with an E. He said his father was very rich, and that one day he would come for him." In that moment, time seemed to stop. The whisper wasn't merely the innocent imagining of a child. It was a key, turning slowly in the lock of a door sealed for 12 years. A missing boy, an orphanage burned to the ground, records erased without a trace. And behind it all, someone within Jonathan's own family had betrayed him. If your child had been stolen from you, and after more than a decade a strange girl claimed she had once known him, what would you do? Would you dismiss it as the desperate illusion of a hope long dead, or would you tear the world apart to uncover the truth? Stay here. This is not just a mystery. This is a journey through pain, betrayal, and the courage it takes to believe that miracles can still happen. In the vast, echoing halls of the Whitmore Estate, a father had been living like a ghost. But sometimes it takes only one sentence, one blurred memory from the mouth of a child, to reignite the flame of life. Jonathan Whitmore could not yet know that in that fleeting moment he had taken the first step into the most brutal battle of his life. Not in boardrooms or financial empires, but in the shadows of a buried past and the truth that refused to stay hidden. Because sometimes the memory of a child is the torch that leads grown men back to faith. Before we step into the next chapter, if this story has stirred something deep within your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel. Give it a like and share it with others so we can continue to spread soul-stirring stories every single day. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment with the name of your city or country so we can see just how far this emotional journey has reached across the world. Every time you share, you help keep the flame alive, giving stories like this a chance to be told and to be heard. And now, let us continue with part 2, where the truth begins to surface and the long-buried past starts to rise. Jonathan Whitmore turned slowly, his gaze as sharp as a blade, sweeping across the mother and daughter standing motionless beneath the soft light spilling from the portrait above. He didn't need to ask. He already knew they had no right to be here. In this mansion, especially on the anniversary of his son's death, no one was permitted near. The West Wing. No footsteps, no voices, no signs of life, only silence. But now, that silence had been torn apart by a sentence too impossible to believe. He walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps. Emily Carter, the new maid, stood with her head bowed, face pale, her hands clenched tightly around a dust rag gone limp from her grip. Instinctively, she stepped in front of her daughter, as if her body alone could shield the child. Jonathan stopped, just a few paces away. The girl had a tousled crown of golden hair, a narrow face, and eyes that gleamed with an odd clarity, not the fear he was so used to seeing in other children. Her gaze was fixed on the portrait, unwavering, as though she were staring at something from her past that refused to let her go. His voice came low and cold. "Why are you here?" Emily stammered, apologizing, explaining that her car had broken down that morning and she hadn't been able to take her daughter to school. The girl's name was Lily. She was 13 years old. Emily had told her not to wander. She was sorry. They would leave immediately. But the girl didn't move. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't look at Jonathan. Her eyes remained locked on the painting. One step, then another. Lily moved closer to the hearth. Her small hand curled into a fist. She lifted her chin and stared into the boy's face in the portrait. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, but each word landed with perfect clarity. "I used to live with him. At St. Helena Orphanage. His name was Caleb, but he once said his real name started with a D. He tried to write it in the dirt once. D-A-N. He said his father was very rich and would come for him one day." Jonathan felt as if someone had kicked him hard in the chest. The air drained from his lungs. He braced himself against the edge of the fireplace to stay upright. His heart pounded wildly. A feeling, long buried, long feared, and longed for in equal measure, surged up from the pit of his soul. Hope. Emily whispered through her tears, pleading with her daughter to stop, to say no more. But Lily stood firm. She looked directly at Jonathan, her eyes steady, unflinching. "I know it was him. He had the same eyes as in this painting. And he used to draw a dog named Scout, a brown dog with floppy ears, very gentle. He missed that dog so much. He said his mum used to call it her little loyal friend." Jonathan froze. That name, Scout. No one outside the family knew that name. It wasn't in the press. It wasn't in the police reports. They had protected every private detail. No one knew what his son called the dog. No one knew what he liked to draw, what games he played, what words he whispered in the seaside house. No one, except the boy himself. And now this strange girl was speaking of those things as if she had stepped out of a dream that had rotted in his heart for 12 long years. His voice came rough, scraping its way out of his throat. "Young lady, what are you saying? Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Lily shook her head gently. "I'm not mistaken. Caleb wasn't an orphan. He told me that. He remembered a gate with the letter W. He said his mother had died. He couldn't remember his father's name, but he remembered there were books everywhere, and dark wood, and a wooden bird that spun on the roof." Her voice caught. "And I believed him. No one else did. But I did, because he told me his father would come for him someday." Jonathan Whitmore looked at Lily. She was no longer just a curious child who had wandered into a forbidden space. Standing before him was a living fragment of memory, a fragile thread of truth suffocated for years. And if she wasn't lying, if even a fraction of what she said was real, then it meant his son was still alive somewhere in this world. Not ashes, not a frozen smile in a frame, but a living, breathing soul, waiting to be found. He turned to Emily, the woman who trembled, unable to lift her eyes. This girl was her daughter. He needed to know everything. When it began, where, and why her memory was so vividly sharp. Because, from the moment Lily had spoken, Jonathan Whitmore's life had crossed into an entirely new chapter. It was no longer a chapter of mourning, it was one of movement. Because if there was even a single chance that what the girl said was true, he would not stop. He would burn the world down if he had to. But this time, he would not give up until he found his son. Jonathan Whitmore took a step back, his eyes never leaving the girl standing in front of him, so small yet so unshakably steady that it startled him. The words she had just spoken could not be a coincidence. There was simply no way a 13-year-old child, daughter of a maid who had only been in his house for less than a month, could so precisely describe things that had never once been made public. No one outside the family knew of the black iron gate with the raised letter W that marked the entrance to the Whitmore Estate. No one knew about the white wooden gull he had mounted on the roof of the beach house, a simple decoration, but one he had installed himself on the morning of his son's 6th birthday. And Scout, the brown Labrador, Daniel's faithful companion, who had lain at the boy's feet while he colored on the living room floor. That child had loved to draw with wax crayons, covering every piece of paper he could find with images of their house, the sea, and that dog. Those memories existed in no police report, no press article. Jonathan and his wife, Eleanor, had kept them sealed away as the last private fragments of a life they had loved and lost. What Lily had just shared was not something a stranger could invent. Turning slowly, Jonathan stepped toward the hearth, lifting his eyes to the painting. Daniel, just 6 years old, stared back with bright eyes and that stubborn, playful smile, holding a small wooden model of a ship in his hands. He had once dreamed of building ships when he grew up. Jonathan could still hear his giggle echoing through the sunlit garden the day Scout grabbed the model ship by its tail and dashed in circles around the yard. It had been a golden afternoon, full of light and laughter he thought had vanished forever. But now, that same light flickered back to life through the fragile voice of a child. Emily stepped forward, her voice faltering under the weight of her nerves. "Sir, I know how hard this must be to believe, but Lily's never been one to make things up. I adopted her 3 years ago, from St. Helena Orphanage. Back then, she used to talk about a boy she called Caleb. Her best friend, she said. I thought he was just imaginary like most kids have. But later, when I learned about what had happened to Daniel Whitmore and when I saw the portrait in the hall, I started to wonder. Maybe Caleb and Daniel were the same boy." Jonathan said nothing. His eyes had hardened, stretched tight like wire, but behind them, his mind was racing. His instincts told him this was not fantasy. This was a lead. And it was the first real lead in 12 long years to carry enough weight to steal the breath from his lungs. Lily stood still, her hands clasped together. Then she spoke, soft and almost like asking permission. "I kept a drawing he gave me. He gave it to me the day another kid took my necklace. He said he'd protect me. He gave me the picture and said, 'As long as you have this, you'll never be alone. Would you like to see it?'" Jonathan nodded. The girl reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Its edges were worn, the creases soft and pale from time. With trembling hands, Jonathan took it from her. It was small, wrinkled, and drawn in wax crayon. A blonde girl holding hands with a dark-haired boy. Next to them stood a big dog, floppy ears, brown fur, its tail curled up in an eager, friendly pose. Behind them, a house by the sea with open windows. And, on the roof, a spinning weather vane shaped like a white bird, turning in the wind. Jonathan could barely breathe. He remembered the wall where Daniel had once drawn that same bird with a crayon, describing it as his favorite thing in the world. And the dog, and those eyes. Only Daniel drew that way. Only his son could have captured a memory no one else had seen but them. His fingers clutched the picture like it was a lifeline, pulling him up from the abyss. The girl had kept this piece of their past for years, and now it had brought him to a truth he could no longer deny. Daniel was alive. Somewhere in this vast world, his son still existed, and Jonathan would find him, no matter the cost. Because no one remembers details like that unless they lived them. This wasn't coincidence. This was memory. And the memory was far too exact to be a mistake. Jonathan Whitmore stood motionless for a long time, his hand still gripping the crumpled drawing, as if letting go would cause everything to vanish into smoke. The smudged strokes of wax crayon held more weight than any legal document he had encountered in his long, storied career. It was not just a child's sketch. It was a living fragment of memory, a confirmation more powerful than words that his son still existed somewhere beyond the frame of that portrait. But to move from a drawing to the truth, he needed more. He turned to Emily, his voice low but resolute. "You said you adopted Lily from St. Helena Orphanage. Tell me everything you know about that place." Emily nodded, her hand still resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. "Yes, sir. I used to volunteer there when I was younger. Later, once I had a more stable job, I applied to adopt a child, and I chose Lily. She was around 10 years old at the time, quiet, often lost in thought. But whenever I asked about her past, about any family she remembered or things she'd been through, she always spoke about a boy named Caleb. He was a little older, barely, talked, and the other children called him Mute Caleb. But to Lily, he was everything. He was her only friend, her protector." Jonathan frowned. "And the orphanage, where is it now?" Emily hesitated. "St. Helena no longer exists. It burned down about 3 years ago, just 1 week after Caleb ran away. I know because I was preparing Lily's adoption paperwork around that time. When I heard the place had burned, I rushed to complete the process, fearing the children would be scattered to other homes and I'd lose contact with her." Jonathan felt a cold pressure grip his chest. Burned. The orphanage that may have imprisoned his son for years had been reduced to ashes, and the timing, just 1 week after a boy escaped, was too precise. It felt less like coincidence and more like someone trying to wipe the slate clean. He asked, "Was there an investigation? Did the police find anything unusual?" Emily shook her head. "From what I was told, the official report blamed faulty wiring in the administrative wing. The fire broke out late at night. No injuries, thankfully. But all the records were destroyed. Every file, every birth certificate, every adoption paper, gone. Oddly, only the admin wing was affected. The children's dormitories were barely touched. I remember clearly because one of the elderly sisters who'd been there for years said it was as if someone had made the past disappear, as if the children had never existed." A chill ran down Jonathan's spine. He had been through countless financial investigations, sat in rooms where men wore calm faces while hiding rot beneath numbers. And this felt exactly the same. This wasn't an accident. It was a cleanup. Someone had erased the trail of a child. Someone had known that Daniel or Caleb escaped and could not afford to leave behind a single trace. He looked at Lily. The girl was clutching the silver necklace at her collar, the one Caleb had protected for her, the one that led him to draw her that picture. That was why she never forgot him, and it might also be why her life was now in danger. The air inside the house felt suddenly thick, heavy, with the weight of truth too long buried. Jonathan knew he couldn't move forward alone. This was no longer just about a father's grief. This was a conspiracy. A kidnapping planned with care, a child's life wiped clean and renamed. And now perhaps the very person behind it was watching him from within his own walls. He turned to Emily. "From this moment on, you and your daughter will not stay in the staff quarters. You'll move into the East Guest Wing. I'll have security assigned to both of you, and you are not to speak of this to anyone else in this house. No cooks, no gardeners. No one." Emily's eyes widened, confused and afraid. "Sir, what's happening?" Jonathan looked at her, his voice low and grave. "I don't know yet. But if what Lily says is true, then someone used an entire orphanage to hide my son, and if they were willing to burn down a building to erase the trail, they won't hesitate to do worse to the child who just brought that memory back to life." Lily looked at him, her eyes no longer filled with uncertainty. In them now burned something else, a signal, a silent plea for protection. And Jonathan knew, with a clarity that struck through the fog of grief and disbelief, that he had just stepped into a labyrinth of shadows. But this time, he would not turn back. Not when he knew the light might still be waiting at the end. And that light bore the name Daniel. The drawing lay quietly atop the mahogany desk in Jonathan Whitmore's study. He had placed it there upon returning from the conversation with Emily and Lily, the lamplight casting a soft angle that made each crayon stroke rise into clarity. A blonde-haired girl held hands with an older boy. Behind them stood a familiar brown dog with drooping ears and a tail curved like a question of joy. Far in the distance, a seaside house rested beneath a spinning weather vane shaped like a white bird, turning gently in the wind. Simple, childish, but real, a living memory. Jonathan sat silently for a long time, his hands no longer touching the drawing, as if afraid that one careless gesture might scatter it like ash. In his mind, images long buried began to rise. Daniel at 5 years old, his bright, curious eyes. The boy would sit in the back corridor of the house where the afternoon light spilled in, clutching his colored pencils and mumbling made-up stories to the rhythm of his own imagination. Scout lay beside him, eyes lazy but always alert to the boy's every movement. That dog had been inseparable from Daniel, appearing in every family photo, every home video, always close, always watching. Jonathan remembered vividly the day Daniel had drawn his very first picture of Scout. Eleanor had just come home from the hospital after another round of treatment. Daniel climbed onto the bed, holding up his crayon masterpiece with pride, and said, "Mummy, you have to get better so we can draw more together. I want to draw our whole house by the sea." Jonathan had been standing in the doorway, turning away quickly, tears hot behind his eyes. And now, nearly 12 years later, he was staring at another drawing. Not made by Daniel, but echoing everything that once lived within him. Lily had said the boy. Caleb Daniel had given it to her, after stepping between her and a larger boy named Dennis at St. Helena. Dennis had torn the silver necklace from Lily's neck. Caleb had said nothing. He simply stepped forward, placed himself between them, and met Dennis's glare with a quiet, cold resolve. Dennis returned the necklace, pale and trembling. And later Caleb gave Lily the drawing as a kind of promise, a gesture of comfort. A child with no voice, no name of his own, no family standing behind him, yet he still had gentleness, still had strength, and loyalty as unshakable as the tide. Just like Scout. Jonathan's hand curled into a fist. That detail alone shattered any remaining doubt. The name Scout had never once appeared in the press. After the abduction, their world had been sealed shut. Police, media, private investigators, opportunists, everyone saw only what the family allowed, carefully chosen images, polished statements. No one outside their circle had known about Scout. And certainly no one could have invented a brown Labrador named Scout, Daniel Whitmore's closest friend, unless they had once shared the same space, the same breath, the same hours of sunlit memory. Lily wasn't lying. And Caleb, whatever name they'd given him in that place, was a disguise. Daniel had been renamed, rewritten, but he had not forgotten. He remembered the house by the sea. He remembered Scout. And he remembered that he was not an orphan. Jonathan exhaled, a deep, wearied breath, the kind that seemed to draw from the marrow. For a moment, the weight on his shoulders felt twice as heavy. But beneath that heaviness stirred something new, faith, hope, resolve. He rose to his feet, cast one last long look at the drawing, then carefully slid it into the drawer with a lock. No one else could see it, not yet. This drawing was no longer just a memory, it was a clue, the first thread in a tapestry that had been torn to shreds. And from this moment forward, he knew he had to follow it, to the end, not for honor, not to satisfy the fury that burned low in his chest, but for Daniel, the boy who had refused to forget. So how could a father ever forget the hope of finding his son again? He couldn't, not ever. The drawing lay quietly on the broad mahogany desk in Jonathan Whitmore's study, still untouched from the night before. Though morning light had yet to fully pour through the towering windows of the Whitmore Estate, Jonathan had already been up for hours, seated in silence as he turned page after page of old files, photographs, police reports, witness statements. Each detail from the day Daniel vanished was carefully spread before him, rearranged like fragments of a shattered clock he was trying to rewind. But one folder sat unopened until now left untouched since the symbolic funeral they had held for his son. It was the private report from the security firm he had hired to investigate alongside the official police inquiry. And within it was a name he had never quite made peace with: Langston, his brother-in-law. The man who had served as CEO of Whitmore Capital for 3 consecutive years, following Daniel's disappearance and Eleanor's death from grief. Langston, the husband of Eleanor's younger sister, was brilliant, composed, and without any notable flaw in his record of financial stewardship. But Jonathan had never trusted him completely. There was something too smooth, too polished, too quietly cold about Langston that left a permanent unease in Jonathan's gut. When Daniel vanished, Langston was the first to suggest temporarily freezing Eleanor's charitable foundation funds. He had also overseen the sale of the seaside house in Rockport, the one Jonathan and Eleanor had built as a haven for Daniel. "We need liquidity. We need to preserve the company's image," Langston had said. And in the thick fog of grief, Jonathan had agreed. Now, looking back, he saw just how blind his pain had made him. He reached for the package his private investigator had delivered just that morning. Inside was a sealed evidence bag, recently recovered from a misplaced archive at the police station. It contained a thin gold ring with the letter L etched into its inner band. For 12 years, it had been catalogued as unidentified debris, ignored until Jonathan demanded a re-examination. The police had never confirmed its owner. They called it incidental, possibly dropped by a passerby. But Jonathan remembered too clearly. Langston had a ring just like this. He used to twist it around his finger when he was under stress. It had belonged to his father, a keepsake he wore constantly. The L stood for Lawrence, Langston's middle name. He'd been proud of that ring, but after the kidnapping, it vanished. Jonathan held the ring under the desk lamp, the scratch along the edge, the fading of the inscription. It matched his memory with unnerving precision. Why had it shown up at the scene? Langston had claimed he was in San Francisco that day, attending a shareholder conference. Jonathan remembered because he had signed off on the travel request himself. But afterward, no one from the company could confirm seeing him in person. There were only emails, a few phone calls relayed through a secretary. If Langston had lied, it meant he could have been in Boston, the city where Daniel disappeared, and this ring might be the only surviving proof. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, eyes shut. One question echoed through his mind like a tolling bell. Had someone within his own family betrayed him? Eleanor had once said Langston adored Daniel, but affection did not guarantee innocence, especially when Daniel's very existence meant Langston would forever remain in the background. Daniel was the heir, Langston merely the executor, but when Daniel was gone, power shifted. Control of assets, influence within the company, everything landed in Langston's hands. Jonathan unlocked his phone and called a man he hadn't spoken to in years, his old private investigator. The man had once dug into shady dealings of international partners and never left a trail. Jonathan's voice came low and hoarse, firm with purpose. "I need you to reopen the travel records for Langston during the week Daniel disappeared. No emails, no obvious channels, quietly. Also, check the past 5 years for any connections between him and children's charities, especially orphanages linked to Eleanor's foundation." The man didn't ask questions. He understood. And so did Jonathan. If his instincts were right, if this ring truly belonged to Langston, then everything had been orchestrated by someone inside his home. And if that man could disappear overnight with a child, then reappear as the grieving family's steady hand, it wasn't impossible to believe he could burn down an entire orphanage just to erase the trail. Jonathan looked at the ring again. It lay silent, small, curled in the center of his palm. But beneath its worn gold was a lie, long buried and never exposed. And now, at last, that lie was beginning to tremble under the weight of a truth that refused to stay hidden. Langston arrived at the Whitmore Estate late the next afternoon, like a gust of wind slipping into a house that had grown too still. The sleek black Bentley rolled to a stop on the stone-paved drive that curved into the heart of the grounds. The moment the wheels stilled, the door opened, and out stepped Langston, immaculate in a grey tailored suit, hair neatly combed, and wearing that same thin, familiar smile that hadn't changed in years. But to Jonathan, that smile no longer meant warmth. It was a mask, a polished shell hiding something he was now determined to uncover. Jonathan was already waiting in the grand sitting room. He hadn't called. He hadn't sent word. But he wasn't surprised to see Langston appear. Men who carry secrets always know when the ground beneath them begins to shift. They can smell the stirring air of suspicion better than most. Langston entered and took a slow look around, as if checking whether anything had changed in the house that once belonged to a whole family. He smiled faintly. "You're looking better, John. Haven't seen you around the office much lately." Jonathan nodded, his voice steady. "Work's fine. I've had things to think through." Langston sat across from him, one leg crossed over the other, hands resting lightly on his knee. His eyes, sharp as ever, flicked briefly around the room before landing on a faint outline on the desk where the wooden box had been. He didn't mention it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Jonathan broke the silence. "You remember the ring your father left you? The one with the letter L engraved inside?" Langston raised an eyebrow. "Of course. I lost it years ago. Must have been while traveling abroad. I was sorry to lose it." Jonathan met his gaze directly. "And what if I told you I found one just like it? At the scene of the incident from 12 years ago, what would you think?" The room dipped into quiet tension. Langston paused for half a second, then gave a soft chuckle. "Could be a coincidence. A lot of people have names that start with L. Engraved rings aren't rare." But Jonathan had seen what he needed. That half-second hesitation was louder than any protest. He didn't need explanations. He was watching every flicker of Langston's eyes, every shift in his posture. Langston still wore calm like a second skin, but beneath it, Jonathan saw the coiled alertness of a man calculating every word. Jonathan changed tone, casually. "I heard you visited St. Helena the year we held that charity event. Is that right?" Langston nodded. "Yes. I was scouting locations for an education initiative." "Why?" Jonathan's voice was slower now, almost conversational. "The orphanage burned down 3 years ago. A week before that, a boy escaped." Langston's eyebrows lifted. This time the surprise looked genuine. "I had no idea. That wasn't in the news." Jonathan gave a slight smile. "It wasn't. No one noticed. Unless they were watching closely. Or unless they were connected." Langston stood and moved to the window, his gaze drifting toward the garden, though there was nothing out there to see. Silence lingered in the room. Jonathan rose and walked toward him, stopping just behind. "I'm reopening everything," he said quietly. "This time, not just to make peace, but to find out who stood behind Daniel's disappearance. Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" Langston turned to face him. For a brief moment, his expression changed, the smile disappeared, the rehearsed politeness dropped away. And what was left was something cold, direct. I know you're hurting, John, and grief can make us see patterns that aren't there, but be careful. Some memories, if you dig too hard, can bring everything down around you. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't respond. But he heard the message clearly. It wasn't concern. It was a warning. And that warning only solidified what he already believed. Langston was hiding something, and that something had to do with Daniel. When Langston left, Jonathan returned to his study. He unlocked the drawer, retrieved the ring. His hand tightened around it. Today, his suspicions were no longer built on intuition alone. They had been confirmed in the eyes of a man who had just slipped, even if only for a moment. And once a mask begins to crack, no lie can hold together forever, not under the weight of the truth, waiting to be revealed. Dusk had barely settled when the knock echoed through the east guest wing of the Whitmore Estate, where Emily and Lily had been staying ever since the girl revealed her secret about Daniel. Emily was folding a pile of wool sweaters while Lily sat by the window, lost in a book. The girl had barely spoken since arriving at the estate, but in her eyes now glimmered something fragile and unfamiliar, a faint light of hope. Emily opened the door to find Thomas standing there, Jonathan Whitmore's long-time personal assistant. His usually composed face was drawn tight with tension. He says it's urgent. He wants both of you in the study. Now. Without asking questions, Emily wrapped a scarf around Lily's neck and took her hand. Together, they hurried down the dim hallway, shadows from the tall windows bending and shifting like silent watchers. Outside, the wind hissed through the glass, and, inside, the entire house seemed to hold its breath, as if bracing for a storm no one could name. When they entered the study, Jonathan was standing near the fireplace, arms folded. The drawing had been put away, but on the desk lay a map. A manila folder burst open with documents and a steaming cup of untouched tea. He turned to face them. His gaze no longer held the calm of the night before. It was heavier now, measured, urgent. I need to speak with both of you, but first, Emily, I want you to recount everything, in full detail. Exactly how Lily knew Daniel, the timeline, every moment. Emily nodded, her voice trembling slightly. She repeated what she had told him before, step by step, without omitting a word. Jonathan listened intently, not to confirm the memory this time, but to test it, to find cracks, inconsistencies, weaknesses. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. Was there anyone else at the orphanage who showed particular interest in Lily? Anyone who tried to adopt her and didn't follow through? Emily paused, thinking, then nodded. There was a man. She hesitated. Around the time Lily was 8, he came a few times, but was never allowed private access to the children. After that, he disappeared. I didn't think much of it. My adoption had already been approved. Why do you ask? Jonathan didn't answer right away. He stepped to the desk and lifted a printed photo. It was a grainy image from an old security camera outside a modest hotel in Maine. The man in the image stood slightly turned, his face partially obscured, but Jonathan knew. Langston. He turned to Emily, voice low. I believe he knows about Lily, possibly more. Possibly that she's connected to Daniel. If I'm right, you and your daughter are in danger. Emily's face turned pale. That's not possible. He never. Jonathan cut her off. I confronted him this morning. He knows I've reopened the investigation. He knows I'm coming for the truth, but he didn't warn me. He warned me about memory, about digging too deep, which means he's preparing. And if Lily is the thread that connects Daniel to the past, then she's no longer safe. Lily gripped her mother's hand tightly, eyes wide. I'm not afraid. If he's still alive, I can't stay silent. I promised him I'd never forget. I kept that promise. Jonathan stepped closer, his expression softening. I know. You've done something brave. But from this moment forward, you don't leave the house. There will be security at all times. Emily, I need your absolute silence. No phone calls, no messages to friends or family, no one. We don't know who's listening." The room thickened with quiet. Jonathan returned to the desk and opened a thin envelope. He slid a document across the surface. "This is what I received from my investigator. Langston made a private contribution to a subsidiary organization under the Eleanor Foundation. He did it without my approval. 3 years ago, that same organization had direct involvement with St. Helena. All records vanished after the fire." His voice slowed, weighted with certainty. He knew the orphanage held a secret. He may have gone there for Daniel, but when Daniel escaped, he wiped everything clean. And now, with Lily here, he knows time is running out. Then, as if summoned by the truth itself, the sound of the doorbell echoed from the front hall. Sharp, unexpected, no prior call, no announced guest. Jonathan turned toward the hallway, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. If he knows about her, he could be standing on the other side of that door. By the time Jonathan stepped out of his study, night had begun to press against the high windows of the Whitmore Estate. Each footfall of his on the wooden floor echoed like a warning strike in the tense quiet that wrapped the house like a shroud. Thomas stood waiting near the front corridor, his posture tight, face more strained than Jonathan had seen in years. He leaned in and whispered, "There's no one at the door, just an envelope, no courier, no vehicle, no tracks." Jonathan descended the steps and picked up the envelope left on the threshold. There was no postmark, no name, no return address, just a folded sheet of paper inside, printed in stark black ink. "Stop, if you don't want to lose another child." His heartbeat missed a beat. No names, no signatures, no trace. But it was enough. The message was clear. Whoever was behind this was not only watching his every move, they now knew about Lily, knew what she had said, knew what she had unlocked. Jonathan folded the paper slowly, fingers tight, then turned to Thomas. "Get the car ready, call the private security team, rotate the entire night staff, and have someone lock down the rear gate. From now on, no one comes or goes without direct approval from me." Thomas nodded and immediately pulled out his phone. Jonathan turned and headed back, toward the east wing, where Emily and Lily were still waiting. Their eyes found his the moment he entered, both filled with questions they didn't know how to voice. He didn't speak right away, but Lily, watching him carefully, seemed to understand. She tightened her grip on her mother's hand, and though her expression was calm, there was something else rising behind her gaze, no longer fear, but resolve. Jonathan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We're running out of time. If I'm right, Langston or someone working for him has been watching ever since Lily appeared. We need to move before he does." Emily hesitated. "But what if he's watching us right now? Is it even safe to leave?" Jonathan looked at Lily, then back at Emily. "We can't wait. That boy has waited 12 years. We may have only days left. Maybe hours before the trail vanishes forever." That night, the three of them slipped out of the estate through a passageway hidden beneath the eastern stairs, one that led to the old stables near the tree line. Thomas had arranged a dark windowed vehicle, and they took back roads that wound far from the main highways. Jonathan said little during the drive. His thoughts moved too quickly, too sharply. Every minute felt compressed. Every decision now held the weight of a dozen years. The road led them east, toward Rockport, and the memory of another life. More than 2 hours later, they arrived at the quiet cliffside cottage, the 2-story house by the sea, where reeds still swayed in the wind as if time had never passed. But Jonathan knew better. Inside, nothing was untouched. He unlocked the door. The hinges groaned as they opened into silence. The scent of old wood and layered dust greeted them like the breath of memory itself. He led them into the library, Daniel's old world, the room where laughter had once echoed in the soft light of afternoon. Beneath the worn rug, a low wooden door opened into the storage space. Below, Jonathan lifted it and shone his flashlight downward, revealing stacks of boxes and forgotten crates thick with dust. but he remembered Daniel had kept a green box here, labelled in a child's scrawl with a shaky letter D. It was still there. He opened the lid slowly. The papers inside were yellowed, the corners curled, but the drawings had survived. One by one, he lifted them out. A black iron gate, a two-story building with a bell tower, a room with a large fireplace and iron bars over the windows, and in the corner of one sketch, written in faint pencil, a line that made Jonathan's breath catch. "I'm not an orphan. I have a father. I will wait." Lily leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's St. Helena. I remember the bell tower. That's where I met Caleb." Jonathan gripped the drawings, the edges of the paper soft with age, but every stroke sharp with meaning. These were not mere scribbles. They were signals, messages, cries for help. Preserved by a child who had refused to forget, Daniel had not let go of his past, not of his name, not of his father, and now Jonathan would not let go of him. Outside, the wind whipped across the cliffs, and the sea roared in the distance. But inside Jonathan Whitmore, the silence had broken. The race had begun. Not against time, but against the man who had stolen everything. And this time, Jonathan would be the one who reached the end. The first light of morning crept through the worn wooden slats of the seaside house, casting long, golden fingers across the floorboards, still marked by the footprints of a boy lost too long. Jonathan sat alone by the window on the second floor, his eyes fixed on the roof beyond, where the small weather vane shaped like a white gull spun gently in the breeze. He had mounted it himself, years ago, on Daniel's 6th birthday. The boy had asked for a bird on the roof, so he'd always know when the wind was rising that the sea was near, that home was close, and that his parents were not far. 12 years had passed. The house had changed hands more than once, but somehow, miraculously, no one had removed that tiny bird. It remained, solitary and persistent, like the memory of a boy who had never truly left. Jonathan stood, still clutching the sheaf of drawings he'd found in the storage room the night before. They were proof, unshakable proof, that Daniel had been taken to St. Helena, that he had remembered, that he had never surrendered his past. But one drawing refused to leave Jonathan's thoughts. It showed a small house nestled among pine trees, its roof slanted, a low wooden gate in front, and a crumbling fence running along the edge. Atop the roof, impossibly, was the same white, gull-shaped weather vane spinning against a blank sky. Beneath the sketch, in faint pencil, were the words, "I remember home. But this is not home. I'll go back to where the white bird is." And Dad, Jonathan knew, then this was not just memory. It was a message. Daniel had once been brought somewhere nearby, somewhere close enough that the image of their old home could be copied. And now, Jonathan had to follow the trail before it vanished again. He called his private investigator at once, instructing him to search the entire Rockport region within a 20-mile radius, focusing on abandoned properties, buildings purchased under false names, or charities connected, even distantly, to Langston. While waiting for the report, he took Emily and Lily for a walk along the beach. A simple act, a quiet offering, something to keep Lily grounded amid the storm rising around them. The girl ran through the shallows, her hair catching the sunlight in golden strands, and for a brief, aching second, Jonathan saw Daniel again. 2 children, 2 pieces of a story buried too long. That afternoon, the phone rang. The detective's voice was sharp with urgency. "There's a house, deep in the pine woods, near the Maine border. It matches the sketch almost exactly. It was once owned by a religious organization no one can trace. Now it's under the name of a charity linked to Langston, though not directly. No one officially lives there, but satellite tracking shows consistent activity." Jonathan said nothing. He stood slowly, hand tightening around the phone. "That's it. I want a team on site. No police, no noise. I'm going." That evening, as Emily and Lily rested, Jonathan left with two trusted security agents. They drove north in silence, the road growing darker and narrower, winding deep into cold, damp forest. Gravel cracked beneath the tires. The trees grew taller, closer. The headlights barely cut through the thick black. As they neared the clearing, they killed the lights and approached on foot, every step deliberate. There it was, the house from the drawing. It stood alone, roof sagging slightly under years of weather, windows dark, its silhouette pale under the moonlight. But on the rooftop, the final confirmation waited, a white gull-shaped weather vane spinning gently in the wind. Not a coincidence, a sign, a marker, a cry. They moved quietly, hugging the walls. Jonathan gestured for silence and pressed his ear to the wooden door. Inside, faint sounds a turning page, a soft footstep. Someone was awake. He nodded. They pushed the door open. The house was dim, old, thick with the scent of mold and charred wood. They moved silently up the narrow staircase, the floorboards whispering under their feet. At the end of the hall, a single door glowed with the soft yellow of a desk lamp behind it. Jonathan reached for the handle. The door creaked open. Inside, sitting alone beneath the warm light, was a teenage boy with dark hair and eyes that pierced straight through Jonathan's chest like glass through skin. The boy turned, calm, not startled. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and steady. "Who are you?" Jonathan couldn't answer right away. His throat clenched, his breath caught. Because how could he say it? How could he explain that he had crossed 12 years of silence, of loss, of unrelenting darkness just to find those eyes again? How could he explain that a little bird on a rooftop had been the only thing guiding him home? There, in the heart of the woods, stood the house from Daniel's drawing. And there, under its roof, sat the boy once known as Caleb, now revealed at last as Daniel, his son. That night, the moon spilled a pale silver glow across the stillness of the forest, its light slipping through the dusty window panes of the small upstairs room where Jonathan stood face to face with the boy the young man he had spent over a decade searching for. This was not the child, with the bright smile frozen in the photograph above the fireplace back at the Whitmore Estate. The boy before him now was lean, quiet, his eyes holding a depth no child should ever have had to carry, and the voice was soft, low, like wind moving through pine branches. "Who are you?" Jonathan stepped forward, slowly, his hands hanging loose by his sides, open, vulnerable, showing he carried nothing but the truth in his chest. "My name is Jonathan Whitmore. A name you might have heard once, or maybe not at all. But," he hesitated, then continued, 12 years ago, I had a son. His name was Daniel." The boy said nothing at first. His eyes searched Jonathan's face as if brushing over faint echoes of something half-remembered. The room around them was bare, a single bed, an old desk with worn books stacked carelessly. A drawing on the wall, faded with time. It was of a house by the sea, and on its roof a weather vane shaped like a white gull spinning in a wide, imagined sky. Jonathan's gaze caught on the picture. He had held one just like it. The boy followed his line of sight, then looked back at the sketch. "I used to dream about that house," he said quietly, "all the time. And in the dream, someone called my name. But it wasn't Caleb, it was Daniel." Jonathan's heart clenched. He took another step forward, carefully. "Yes, your name is Daniel. You disappeared shortly after your 6th birthday. Taken from a park in broad daylight, your mother and I searched for you for 12 years. She passed away after 4. Her heart couldn't carry the grief. After that it was just me. But I never stopped looking. Not once." The boy's hands curled into fists, His voice trembled. I remember a woman, blonde hair. She used to come at night, whispered to me, "You have a name, you have a home, someone is waiting." But every time I asked her name, they'd lock me in a dark room. After a while, I stopped believing she was real. I thought maybe I had imagined her. Jonathan's eyes burned with tears under the cold light of the moon. That was your mother, Eleanor. She never believed you were gone. She used to say, "If Daniel is still alive, he'll know somewhere deep inside that he is loved." The boy stood still for a long moment, then moved to the window. The moonlight touched his face, and for the first time, Jonathan saw the eyes clearly, that same grey-brown mix, that same quiet intensity that had once brought him comfort in the darkest days. Daniel looked back at him. "I had a dog. His name was Scout. He went missing when they took me. I still call for him. In my dreams." Jonathan's voice broke. "Scout died a few years after you vanished. He used to wait on the porch every evening, as if you might come walking home. The day he passed, I buried him beneath the maple tree by the steps." Daniel turned, and though there were no tears on his face, his voice splintered. "I wrote my name on the wall once, but they made me erase it. I told a girl once about the dog, about the house with the white bird, but after that they moved me. They said no one would believe me if I kept talking." Jonathan nodded gently. "That girl was Lily. She remembered you. She saw your photo in my home and told her foster mother you were the boy she knew. Her words reopened everything. Without her, I might never have found you." Daniel stepped closer. This time, truly close. He reached out and gently touched Jonathan's wrist, the way someone touches something they're not sure is real. "I thought I'd been forgotten." Jonathan took that hand, frail and cold in his own, and held it. "No, you were never forgotten. You were hidden. But now I'm here, and I won't let you disappear again." Outside, the wind rose, spinning the white gull on the rooftop in slow, steady circles beneath the moon. Inside, in the quiet room, a reunion unfolded without cries or chaos, without the thunder of revelation. Just two pairs of eyes meeting across 12 years of silence and ache. A father had found his son, and a boy had finally heard his name spoken in the light of a long night's end. The moonlight that night spilled across the quiet forest in a pale, silvery hush, filtering through the smudged window of the second-floor room where Jonathan sat, still holding his son's hand. In that moment, nothing else existed but the truth that passed silently between them. There was no more time to divide them, no more memory lost to silence. Only the gaze of father and son, each searching for pieces of themselves in the other, trying to mend what had been scattered across the long years. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly, and Jonathan felt the hesitation in that small gesture, a part of the boy beginning to believe, another part still afraid. It was the fear of a child who had been lied to too many times, locked behind too many doors, told again and again that his past was a dream, his name a mistake, his memory a flaw. Jonathan took a breath and slowly sat down on the old wooden chair beside him. From the inside pocket of his coat, he pulled out a photograph, worn and soft at the edges. He placed it gently in Daniel's hand. It showed the three of them, Jonathan, Eleanor, and little Daniel, no older than 4.5, sitting on the front steps of their house in Rockport, Scout stretched out lazily at their feet. "This is your family," Jonathan said. "This photo was taken a week before you disappeared. You were wearing a red hat with a fire truck badge, because that day you said you wanted to be a hero." Daniel stared at the photo, his brow furrowing and then softening, like a rope being pulled slowly from both ends of memory. "I've dreamed of this before," he said quietly, "many times, but I never thought it was real." Jonathan nodded. "It is real. That's your memory. They tried to take it from you, but they couldn't erase it all." Do you remember the little wooden toy car you used to carry everywhere, the one with your name carved underneath? Daniel flinched. His eyes widened. Yes, I used to hide it in my pillow. Then one day it was gone. They took everything. Jonathan nodded slowly. I know, but I kept a copy. Exactly the same. Would you like to have it back? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He turned his face toward the window, where the moonlight had softened behind a veil of drifting clouds. His voice, when it came, was low and fragile. Then why didn't you come sooner? Why did it take 12 years? Jonathan's hands closed into fists on his knees. He had waited for this question. He had feared it too, because there was no answer that could make the suffering vanish. No truth strong enough to wash away all that Daniel had endured. I searched for you, he said. I searched everywhere, but they told me you were dead. They staged the scene, forged evidence. They made an entire case, complete with reports, timelines, everything. Even the police believed it. Even I did for a time. It took me over a year to understand you had been taken. And by then, every trail had vanished. Daniel stayed quiet, turning the photo in his hands, as if trying to absorb some echo of warmth from that stolen moment. Then why now? Why tonight? Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes steady. Because a girl remembered you. A girl named Lily. She lived with you in the orphanage. She saw your picture in my home and recognized you. That one memory set everything in motion. I started over, reopened files, reconnected every missing piece, and they all led me here. Daniel looked at him for a long time. Then, with a voice still low but now carrying something new, something steadier, he said, I don't know if I can believe everything yet, but I believe your eyes, and I believe in myself, in the dreams I carried with me. Jonathan reached out, his hand resting gently on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel, I don't expect your forgiveness, not now. But I'm here, no longer a man chasing shadows. I'm the one who loved you before you ever spoke your first word. I'm your father, and if you'll let me, I'll walk with you one step at a time until trust is something we build together. And in that quiet moment, Daniel nodded. Not a promise, not a leap. Just a soft, measured nod, the kind that opens a door after years of it being locked. The kind that says, something has begun. The kind that tells a boy at last that the words, I'm your father, are no longer a distant, unreachable truth, but something he can finally feel in the rhythm of his own heart. The moon had risen higher now. The wind brushed along the rooftop, turning the white gull weather vane in soft, steady circles. One turn, then another, as if bearing witness to two souls finding their way back to each other after 12 long years divided by silence and shadow. Dawn cast a soft blush across the tall pines that circled the little house in the woods, painting the world in shades of hope and warning. Inside, Jonathan and Daniel sat across from each other at a chipped wooden table, the silence between them no longer awkward or strained, but settled like the quiet after a long storm. No one hurried. No one wanted to disturb the fragile calm that had finally taken root after 12 years of chaos. But Jonathan knew time was no longer on their side. Every hour lost was a door closing, and the truth, no matter how sharp it might cut, needed to be brought into the light. He reached into the leather bag he had brought from Rockport and pulled out a thick folder, bound with years of questions and pieces of a puzzle once thought unsolvable. This, he said, laying it on the table, is everything I've gathered in my search for you. Some of it you may not be ready for, but there's one part you need to know now. The truth about who was behind it all. Daniel looked up, his gaze no longer carrying the haze of the night before. Something had shifted in him. Perhaps it was the name spoken aloud, his name. Perhaps it was the presence of a father he had only ever seen in dreams. Now sitting across from him, real and steady, His name is Langston Hale, Jonathan said quietly. My brother-in-law. The man who stood beside me in the darkest years after you were taken, and the man who orchestrated every moment of it. Daniel's brow furrowed. Why? Why would he do that? Jonathan's hands curled slowly on the tabletop. Greed and a bitterness he never spoke aloud. Langston was second in command at the company, but I always placed family before profit. Your mother, Eleanor, she opposed him more than once. She discovered signs of money laundering through charitable fronts registered under false names. And Langston knew it. He also knew she was the only one who could make me sever ties with him, and she would have. Daniel exhaled. So he went after her first. Jonathan nodded. Not directly, but by taking away the one thing that held her together. You. When you vanished, she lost the strength to fight. He shattered her heart by stealing what she loved most, and he knew the police would close the case as a clean disappearance. He was right. Daniel lowered his head, flipping through the pages. They showed wire transfers to a charity with a name nearly identical to a legitimate foundation. But in the financial records, the money vanished within hours. One final transaction was traced to a branch of the Eleanor Foundation located in St. Helena, the same orphanage where Lily had once lived. He sent me there, Daniel murmured. Then used the name of charity to control it all. Jonathan nodded. The orphanage was never officially registered. It operated under a religious pretense, isolated, no outside contact. No real birth records. Children were renamed, histories rewritten. And for parents lost in grief, there were no traces left to follow. Daniel sat still for a long moment. Then he asked, his voice low, then why didn't he just kill me? If I was the risk, why keep me alive? Jonathan looked at his son, his voice tightening with pain. Because you were evidence, a living piece of the truth he couldn't erase. Maybe he meant to use you as leverage if it all came crashing down. Maybe he just didn't have the nerve. But whatever the reason, he locked you in the dark. And now you've stepped out of it. Daniel looked out the window. Morning sunlight brushed across the pines, warm but fleeting. There was urgency in his gaze, a kind of quiet fire. I want to face him. I want to look him in the eye and ask, did he ever think that someone else's son could hurt just as deeply as he did? Jonathan placed a steady hand on his shoulder. You'll have that chance. But not through hate. Through truth. We'll bring him into the light, not for vengeance, but to end this. Fully. Finally. No more shadows, no more hiding. Daniel nodded, and in his eyes there was no trace left of the lost boy. There was a young man ready to walk back into the darkness, not to be swallowed by it, but to carry the light with him. The fire had begun, and this time it would not consume another orphanage. This time it would burn down every lie. The meeting took place on a Friday afternoon in the top-floor conference room of the Whitmore Capitol building, where a wall of glass opened out to the city below, its skyline bathed in the amber glow of a fading sun. Langston walked in with the same calm composure he always carried in public. His suit was impeccable, his gold-pinned tie neatly fastened, his gaze as cold and calculating as ever. But today, across the table from him, sat Jonathan. No longer the mild-mannered chairman dulled by the fatigue of a man too old to helm an empire. He was now a father who had walked through fire, whose silence was sharper than any accusation. No assistants were allowed in, no lawyers, no witnesses, only two men and a truth that sat between them like a blade unsheathed. Langston pulled out a chair and sat down across from Jonathan, arms folded. You called me here to say something or just to look at me like that? Jonathan didn't respond right away. He quietly reached into his briefcase and placed a thick folder on the table. Inside were copies of financial transactions, photographs of a secluded house in the woods, a map leading to the St. Helena Orphanage, and the most recent image of Daniel. Jonathan slid the folder across the table. Langston opened it, flipping through each page. His hand trembled just slightly, but enough for a man who had known him for over 30 years to notice. Then he closed the file and pushed it back across the table. He smiled, his voice smooth, as if negotiating a deal. "So my nephew is still alive. I suppose some part of you must be pleased." Jonathan didn't smile. He leaned forward, speaking slowly. "Daniel remembers. Not everything, but enough. Enough to recognize St. Helena. Enough to know who took him there. And enough to know who you are." Langston exhaled and leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "What do you want, Jonathan? My reputation? My wealth? A confession?" Jonathan looked him in the eye. "I want my son to live without fear. I want justice. And I want you, Langston, to face what you've done." Langston was silent for a moment, then laughed. Not loudly, but with a bitter edge. "You think you can bring me down with this? Those transactions have been cleaned, the organizations dissolved. No signatures, no witnesses. And if you think the testimony of a boy locked away for 10 years can unravel an entire system, you're still dreaming." Jonathan rose from his seat and walked slowly to the window, gazing out as the last light of the sun slipped behind the towers. "No one has to believe me right away, but belief spreads faster than money, and once Daniel's story is told, once others begin to speak, you won't be able to stop it." Langston stood as well. His voice was low but taut, like a wire. "What are you planning to do, Jonathan? Broadcast it? Take it to court? Drag the family name through the mud?" Jonathan turned around. "You already did that. To my family, to Eleanor, to Daniel. Now it's time I take it back." Langston stepped toward him, and for the first time his composure cracked. "I kept the boy alive as insurance, Jonathan, in case Eleanor ever dug too deep or you tried to push me out. He was my leverage. Killing him would have been a waste of a valuable asset." Jonathan clenched his fists. "No. Enough is when no more children are locked away, when men like you can't buy silence with blood money. Enough is when Daniel no longer lies awake at night, afraid someone will come drag him back to the place they once called an orphanage." Langston said nothing more. He looked at Jonathan for a long time, then turned and walked out. The door closed behind him so softly it made no sound. But in that room the air had fractured. Jonathan stood, still, his hand resting on the folder. He didn't need a confession. He needed justice. And no matter if the path ahead led through darkness or fire, he would walk it to the end. For Daniel, for Eleanor, and for every child who had ever had their voice stolen. That evening, Jonathan sent copies of the dossier to 3 of the largest news outlets. And for the first time in 12 years, the story would be told not through tears, but through truth. The next morning, as headlines about the scandal involving Langston Hale appeared across major newspapers and rippled through television broadcasts nationwide, Jonathan was not at his office as usual. He was in Rockport, at the seaside home Daniel once called his own, where the white seagull-shaped wind spinner still turned quietly in the morning breeze. Daniel sat beside him, holding a small pendant that hung from a silver chain, something Jonathan had retrieved from one of Eleanor's old keepsake boxes. It was a heart-shaped locket, one Eleanor had always worn close to her chest. Inside was a small photograph of Jonathan and Daniel taken on the boy's 5th birthday. Etched on the back, in delicate handwriting, were the words, "Wherever you are, I will always follow." Daniel opened the locket and looked at the photo, now faded with time, his eyes reflecting a quiet that words could not touch. "I don't remember her face clearly," he said. "Only her voice in dreams. Soft like the sea." Jonathan placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "I, too, have forgotten her voice at times, and I've hated myself for it. But Daniel, memory doesn't live in sound, it lives in feeling, and that feeling has never left you. Daniel nodded, then smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both sorrow and peace. I think she was the only one who never stopped believing I was alive. Jonathan answered softly. She never gave up. Even when the world told her you were gone, she kept a journal every day. She sent letters to places she had only the faintest suspicion about. She searched until her body could no longer keep up. You, Daniel, were the reason she kept breathing in those final years. Daniel clutched the pendant tighter, his hands trembling slightly. I want to keep this with me, Jonathan smiled. It's yours. It has been for a very long time. As the sun rose higher, Jonathan's phone rang repeatedly. News agencies called for interviews. Lawyers relayed updates on fresh evidence. A former employee from the St. Helena facility had come forward, willing to testify that Langston had visited the orphanage multiple times and had signed off on the transfer of unnamed children to peripheral religious institutions. Jonathan gave only one statement to the press. Justice does not begin with vengeance. It begins with truth. And today, the truth is being heard. Later that afternoon, Lily and Emily returned to Rockport. When Lily saw Daniel, she could hardly believe her eyes. His hair was longer, his face had changed in so many ways, but the eyes, the flicker of a smile, and the way he looked at the painting of Scout on the wall, none of that could be mistaken. She ran to him and wrapped her arms around him. I knew it, she whispered. I knew you weren't making it up. Daniel embraced her without a word, but the tears that slid down his cheeks said everything he couldn't. Emily watched them, her eyes glassy with emotion. Jonathan stepped beside her, his voice quiet. Thank you for believing her. If you hadn't listened that day, none of this would be happening. Emily nodded, her voice unsteady. I was once a child. No one believed. I couldn't let my daughter walk that same path. That evening, as the family sat together on the porch, Daniel stood up and pulled a worn piece of paper from his pocket, folded many times over. I wrote this years ago, he said, when I was still at the orphanage, but I never had the courage to send it. His voice quivered slightly. It's a letter to my mother. May I read it? Everyone grew silent. Only the sound of the waves brushing against the shore remained. Mom, if you still remember me, please forgive me for forgetting your face. I was afraid what I remembered was wrong, so I stopped dreaming. But last night, I dreamed of a man whose voice sounded like the one you once described. He told me I didn't have to be afraid anymore, and I believed him. Mom, if I am still alive, then I still remember home. I remember the white bird. I remember the maple tree where Scout used to lie, and I believe you never stopped looking for me. I love you. My name is Daniel Whitmore. When he finished reading, no one spoke. There was no need. Everything that mattered had already been heard. And that night, as the sea breeze rustled through the trees, the white seagull wind spinner on the roof turned again, gently and steadily, like a symbol of a child who was never forgotten, and a mother who became a hero in a tiny heart-shaped locket. Whitmore Estate, once a symbol of power and isolation for so many years, now wore an entirely different air. The heavy curtains that had always remained drawn across the tall windows were now pulled aside, allowing sunlight to flood the wide hall. The solemn, distant portraits of Whitmore ancestors had been taken down, replaced by the innocent hand-drawn sketches of Lily and Daniel. Interspersed with old family photographs Emily had carefully recovered from the estate's long-forgotten archives. What had once been a castle frozen in grief had become, at last, a home. Jonathan walked slowly through the corridor leading to the garden, where the sound of Lily and Daniel's laughter rang bright in the morning light. Daniel held the garden hose, aiming it at the flowers, while Lily squealed with laughter as a few drops splashed onto her hair. To Jonathan's eyes, there was no more beautiful scene. He paused beneath the porch awning, where Emily sat with a journal in her lap and a steaming cup of tea by her side. She looked up and smiled. It was a true smile now, free of the tension and guarded doubt that had once filled her gaze when they first met. "Thank you for keeping your word," she said. "Thank you for not letting Daniel and Lily be forgotten." Jonathan nodded, his voice low. "I only did what I should have done long ago. But it was Lily and you who brought light back into this place. Without you both, I'd have nothing left but stone walls and silent memories." Emily glanced toward Daniel, now in a plain white t-shirt and jeans, no longer a boy bound by blurred memories and locked rooms. He was living now, truly living, beneath his own roof. In the days that followed, Jonathan began the process of restructuring the entire leadership of the company. He formally announced his withdrawal from active management, delegating authority to individuals he trusted, those guided by principle, not ambition. At the same time, he established a new charitable foundation named the Eleanor Whitmore Fund, dedicated to supporting victims of abduction, trafficking, and family separation. With each document he signed, his mind returned to Eleanor's face as she first held Daniel in the hospital, dreaming of a world where every child was loved. Now Jonathan was doing all he could to make that vision real. In the living room, Daniel and Lily sat together at the old piano that had once belonged to Eleanor. Daniel placed his fingers gently on the keys, as if afraid to shatter something sacred. "I think I heard someone play this in a dream once," he said. "It sounded like falling water." Lily nodded. "That was my mom. She used to play it every night." Emily had once told them that during the first 3 years after Daniel vanished, Eleanor kept her nightly ritual, sitting at the piano at exactly 8 o'clock, as if the music could somehow guide Daniel back to her. Daniel nodded and let his fingers find their way across the keys. The notes that followed were slow, imperfect, but full of feeling. In a sunlit room, the piano's quiet melody mingled with the birdsong outside, forming a new kind of music, one born of return and renewal. No more weeping behind locked doors. No more silence pressed into the walls. Only the sound of people who had found each other after the storm. That evening, the long dining table in the formal room was set, not for a special occasion, but simply because they wanted to eat together. Daniel, Jonathan, Emily, and Lily sat down to a meal filled with stories. Tales of planting flowers, of a chubby squirrel hiding in the gutters, of summer plans not yet made. Daniel looked up at the framed photograph of his mother placed in the center of the table. "I think she's smiling," he said softly. Jonathan met his eyes, his own gaze warm. "I know she is, because this is the first time in 12 years that our whole family is sitting down together." And that, he knew, was a beginning, not of a grand new chapter written in the style of grandeur or legacy, but something far more enduring. A house no longer meant to contain grief, but to shelter love. A place where trust could begin again, written day by day, in laughter, in music, and in hearts, learning to believe once more. Whitmore Estate had changed, not through fresh paint or expensive furniture, but through warmth, through forgiveness, and through a boy who had finally found his way home. The days that passed at Whitmore Estate were no longer shrouded in loss or suspicion, yet no matter how warm the sunlight became, there were still corners of the soul that healing could not reach so easily. Daniel now lived within a world that had once existed only in fragmented memories. Some mornings he awoke with his shirt soaked in sweat, haunted by dreams of the narrow, windowless room where he had once been held. There were moments, even in the middle of laughter with Lily, when his voice would suddenly fall silent, his eyes drifting into a distance that no one else could see, lost in a nameless memory. Jonathan saw it all. And he never tried to make Daniel talk, nor did he ask him to forget. He simply remained, like a lamp glowing in the dark, waiting quietly for his son to find his way back from the shadows. One late afternoon, Daniel sat alone in the garden behind the house, where the old maple tree stretched its limbs as if trying to hold him. In his hands was Eleanor's journal, its yellowed pages chronicling every dream, every moment of hope, and every descent into despair. One page read, "Today, Daniel turns 8. I bought you a kite. Even if you don't come home, I want your birthday to remain sacred." As Daniel read those words, tears fell silently onto the paper, and he did not wipe them away. It wasn't sadness. It was part of healing. When Jonathan approached, Daniel remained, seated, his voice soft but steady. "How do you forgive someone like Langston, a man you once called brother, a man who took everything from you?" Jonathan sat beside him, silent for a long moment before answering. "Forgiveness is not acceptance," he said. "Forgiveness is setting yourself free. I carried the weight of my anger for too long, but it didn't bring you back. It didn't save your mother. It only hollowed me out." Daniel nodded gently. "I think I'm learning to forgive too. Not because they deserve it, but because I don't want what they did to keep controlling me." Emily was the first to see what Daniel was quietly building for himself. One day, she found him in Jonathan's study, carefully organizing folders, marking evidence, writing out a list of the children who had once lived at St. Helena but had never been identified. "I want to help them," Daniel told her, his voice clear and firm. "If I got to come back, I want the ones still left behind to see the light too." Emily nodded, her eyes shining with pride. And so, Daniel began to write. Not a manifesto, not a grand exposé, just fragments of memory. Journal entries that spoke of a boy once called Caleb who thought he was invisible. These pieces were posted on the blog of the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation, and soon they began to spread. Strangers reached out. Some remembered a boy who spoke of a dog named Scout. Others couldn't recall names, only the sound of a lullaby sung in the night. Daniel responded to every message. Each reply was a step in his own healing. One afternoon, Lily brought him a small box. Inside were scraps of old wood, torn paper, a rusted bell on a string. "I found it in the storage room at my foster parents' house," she said. "It's from the orphanage. Do you recognize anything?" Daniel picked up a wooden piece engraved with the letter D. His smile came slowly, but surely. "This was our secret box," he said. "I once hid a green stone in it and called it my treasure. It's gone now, but I still remember what it felt like to hold it. That was the first time I ever felt like something was truly mine." These small things, once forgotten, had become the foundation of a boy who had lost his childhood. No scar vanishes completely, but when someone touches it with love rather than pity, it becomes part of a journey instead of a burden. Jonathan looked at Daniel each day with growing belief, not just as the son he had found again, but as someone who could turn pain into purpose. And in the quiet evenings they spent together, they no longer spoke of what had been lost. They spoke of what they would build, of the lives that might be changed through Daniel's words, of a world where forgiveness was not weakness, but the first step toward healing. On an early summer morning, golden sunlight filtered through the aged pine canopy that shaded the Whitmore Estate grounds, casting a gentle glow across the courtyard where Daniel and Lily sat side by side. Their laughter echoed softly through the peaceful air, not merely the sound of joy, but a quiet answer to a long journey through pain, loss, and silence. Once separated, once living in fear, now, beneath those familiar trees, life had begun to bloom again, from the very roots they once believed had withered. From a distance, Jonathan stood with a cup of coffee in hand, his gaze softened by what he saw. His son no longer bore the strained expression of a child learning to survive. Instead, he saw a young man slowly learning to live, to feel, and to love. Whitmore Estate, long a symbol of power and secrecy, had transformed into a place of laughter, of hope, of sunlit mornings where birds gathered at the windowsills and quiet conversations passed between three generations who, at one time, had seemed beyond repair. During one quiet dinner, Emily looked at Jonathan and Daniel and gently said that perhaps all forgiveness begins with being heard. When someone feels truly listened to, they begin to unlock their heart, and from there, the healing begins. Daniel smiled, his hand holding tightly to the small locket that had once belonged to his mother. He said he used to believe that every wound made people weaker, but maybe what truly made us stronger was choosing to live on after being hurt. That was the quiet kind of courage no one else could see, but it was what helped us truly grow. The story of Daniel, of Jonathan, of Eleanor, of Emily, and of Lily was never just about the search for a missing child. It was a journey of belief, of connection between people who once seemed like strangers, yet found one another through truths deeper than blood. It was a path where, at every turn, honesty, compassion, and forgiveness lit the way forward like a lantern in the dark. And now, as you reach the end of this story, I want to ask you something. How do you feel after hearing this journey? Have you ever been left behind in the dark? Are you, perhaps, learning how to forgive yourself or someone from your past? Life is rarely smooth. Sometimes it pushes us into corners we never asked to enter. But if there is still hope, still love, and still belief, then light will find its way in. Even the faintest glimmer can be enough to begin again. If this story spoke to your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share the Emotional Echoes channel to hear more moving and meaningful stories each day. We would love to hear from you, your honest reflections, your heartfelt responses, because through your voice we can bring you stories that are closer to your life, your emotions, and your truth. Today's story has come to a close, but the emotional journey continues. Let us walk beside you on that path. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you strength, peace, happiness, and a full life each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video from Emotional Echoes.